My name is Whitney Phillips, and for the last 5 years, I have studied and written about trolls. Trolls and the trolls who troll them. Since beginning this research in 2008, I've conducted formal interviews with about 25 trolls and have observed and interacted with more trolls than I can count. Altogether, I've spent thousands of hours, yes, thousands, lurking on 4chan's B-board, one of the internet's most infamous and active trolling hotspots, Encyclopedia Dramatica, a wiki devoted to all things troll, Facebook, you may have heard of it, Skype, YouTube, and anywhere else trolling might be afoot. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What exactly is trolling? In a nutshell, trolling in the online sense is a behavioral practice predicated on disruption. It can take many forms, from harmless pranks all the way to behaviors that meet the legal definition of harassment. Although trolling in the online context is several decades old and carries with it a great deal of historical baggage, I've restricted my research focus to subcultural trolling, which coalesced on and around 4chan's B-board in the early mid-2000s. Trolls of the subcultural ilk self-identify as such, partake of a highly stylized and often outrageously offensive aesthetic and vernacular. This is one of the rare G-rated examples. And trade in what the trolls call lulls, a particular sort of antagonistic laughter indicating that the troll's target has responded with a strong negative emotion like anger, frustration, or shock. These are all troll-made images, and in addition to illustrating the troll's, let's say, colorful aesthetic, highlight the troll's preoccupation with emotional disturbance, what the trolls refer to as butt hurt. Another common feature of subcultural trolling is the troll's insistence on anonymity. As a consequence, the precise demographics of this group can be very difficult to establish. That said, I have every indication that the vast majority of subcultural trolls are male, between the ages of 18 and 34-ish, predominantly white, and predominantly English-speaking. For a fun demographic brain teaser, consider this troll-made image, designed by a troll to troll the trolling demographic, essentially making it the inception of trolling. Over the years, I've encountered a number of difficult questions about my research. One of the most persistent and persistently challenging is the question, why study trolls? There are a few unstated assumptions embedded in this question. The first assumption is the idea that trolls are culturally insignificant and are therefore undeserving of academic attention. In response to this assumption, I point to the perhaps surprising cultural ubiquity of trolling. After all, even internet users who don't think they know much about trolling have likely encountered a whole host of behaviors and content created, or at the very least amplified, by trolling subculture. For example, lolcats, which feature images of cute animals captioned with playful misspellings. Rickrolling, in which individuals are unwittingly redirected to a clip of Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up. The nebulous hacker collective known as Anonymous. Anonymous's iconic Guy Fawkes mask, the list goes on. All have ties, and often direct ties, to trolling subculture, making discussions of trolling immediately relevant to discussions of pop culture. A second and much more complicated assumption embedded in the question, why study trolls, is this idea that trolls' behaviors are too offensive and incendiary to warrant much more than simple condemnation. It's not hard to see how someone might draw that conclusion. Trolls frequently target vulnerable populations, revel in racist, sexist, and generally hateful language, and derive amusement from the infliction of emotional distress. What else is there to say other than they're bad guys? The remainder of this talk will focus specifically on this assumption, and in the process of explaining why trolls' behaviors warrant so much more than simple condemnation, we'll make a case for the cultural significance of villains, scoundrels, and rule breakers more broadly understood. First, I'd like to share a few thoughts on transgression, of which trolls are particularly fond. Typically, these behaviors are framed in negative or otherwise destructive terms. So the ways in which transgression tears down existing social structures or challenges our sense of propriety. It makes sense to talk about transgression in these terms because that's exactly what it does. What transgression also does, and which is more frequently overlooked, is provide a window onto the norm, at least what passes as the norm within a particular culture or community. The idea that transgression sheds light on the larger culture harkens to anthropologist Mary Douglas's seminal study of culturally specific taboo, particularly those centering on notions of dirt and dirtiness. For Douglas, dirt, or matter out of place, is only intelligible in the context of existing systems of cleanliness. Put simply, you can't really think of something as being dirty if you don't already have a basic sense of what qualifies as clean. Similarly, cultural aberration is only intelligible in the context of existing social systems. By analyzing that which is regarded as transgressive, then, one is able to reconstruct the cultural value systems out of which the behaviors emerge and against which the behaviors transgress. Distilled down, this idea can be understood thus. Figure out who and what freaks a particular group out, and you are on your way towards understanding what makes that group tick. But that's not all we can learn from transgression. In addition to calling attention to where particular communities draw the line between good and bad, clean and dirty, acceptable and taboo, transgression can help complicate these same borders, and in the process can complicate the clear-cut picture communities often have of themselves. Trolls' various and sundry transgressions provide a striking example. First, trolls' behaviors challenge the seemingly straightforward distinction between positive online behavior, characterized by connection, cooperation, and sharing, and more problematic online behaviors like trolling, of course, cyberbullying, and online harassment. On the traditional view, connection, cooperation, and sharing are good. They are the behavioral ideals against which more problematic behaviors can be measured. As I discovered while researching trolls on 4chan and Facebook, however, trolls' antagonistic behaviors are often every bit as likely to require or result in connection, cooperation, and sharing between trolls as more obviously positive online interactions. Conversely, non-trolling populations can be every bit as tumultuous as trolling populations, sometimes even more so. After all, for there to be an in-group, there has to be an out-group. And what might strike members of the in-group as being perfectly sociable can be explicitly antagonistic or at the very least alienating to members of the out-group, which is true whether community members are trolls, bakers, pizza makers, gardeners, or any other affinity group with which a person might identify. So, while trolls are undoubtedly masters of disruption and antagonism online, they are hardly the only guilty parties. Non-trolls can be every bit as bad, all while engaging in behaviors that are widely regarded as good and which are just as common in trolling circles. Second, trolls call attention to the thin and frequently fuzzy line between normal and unacceptable engagement with personal tragedy. First, the normal side of the equation. In the United States, it is normal for news outlets to sensationalize the human interest details of a particular crime or tragedy. It is normal to stir up controversy in order to court the strongest audience response possible. It is normal for news outlets to benefit financially from the resulting audience distress and from further tragedy. That's just business. However, when trolls engage in similar or identical behaviors designed to exploit and sensationalize tragedy for personal gain, they are condemned, most vocally by sensationalist media, as being callous, cruel, and sociopathic. That trolls' more extreme behaviors can be likened to routine corporate engagement does not and should not mitigate the emotional impact of the troll's behaviors. It does, however, call into question the line that's posited between those who transgress online and those who profit from eerily similar behaviors. Finally, trolls' actions, particularly their most incendiary actions, enact a grotesque pantomime of accepted and at times outright celebrated cultural tropes. Trolls' obsession, trolls' insistence that nothing should be taken seriously online, and eagerness to police the emotional online expression, coupled with their emphasis on dominating opponents, represents the logical extension of the twinned notions of phallocentrism, a philosophical paradigm privileging male-gendered traits and actions, and capitalist ideology, both of which maintain that only the strong, at least those regarded as being the right kind of strong, deserve to survive. Trolls may take these logics to their most extreme conclusions, but at a very basic level, trolls' behaviors are born of and fueled by impulses that can only be described as culturally sanctioned, raising the question, exactly what are people criticizing when they criticize trolls? In short, a close analysis of trolling behaviors reveals that what we know, or what we think we know about the dominant culture, is actually much more complicated than we might initially suspect or care to acknowledge. Good and bad, clean and dirty, acceptable and taboo. There exists a great deal of overlap between, and in fact within, these categories, a fact that trolls and cultural transgressors inadvertently help highlight. Lewis Hyde makes a similar point in his study of trickster figures, which Hyde describes as the mythic embodiment of ambiguity and ambivalence, doubleness and duplicity, contradiction and paradox. As Hyde states, the erasure of these ambiguous trickster figures in favor of more uncomplicated binaries, so good, bad, clean, dirty, acceptable, and taboo, doesn't make these binaries true. In fact, the impulse to frame our behaviors in black and white terms might just blind us to our own moral failings. We may well hope our actions carry no moral ambiguity, Hyde writes, but pretending that is the case when it isn't does not lead to greater clarity about right and wrong. It more likely leads to unconscious cruelty, masked as inflated righteousness. Villains, scoundrels, and rule breakers are important then, because they challenge our facile understanding of us and them, or more importantly, us versus them, and in the process help facilitate a fuller and ultimately healthier perspective on human culture. These insights might not be pleasant, but knowing what distortions are reflected in the funhouse mirror is far preferable to erroneously attributing to some nebulous them all the troubles in the world while we conveniently exist beyond rebuke. This is a problem, because this we, no matter who the we subsumes, but particularly when the we positions itself as the moral majority, is never beyond rebuke. In fact, we might just be the source of the problem. This is the indirect lesson of villainy. Thank you.